Hello everyone. So I welcome you all to the first test discussion class on sociology paper 1, test 1. Okay. So what is going to be the structure of the test discussion? See, in the first class, I would like to emphasize more on sociological imagination, which I think students have not yet developed despite having gone through multiple books and different kind of texts. They are not able to confront questions, or they are not able to understand how do we apply sociological perspective to something like demonetization. How do we apply sociological perspective to something like new education policy, which may come up this year? Okay, इस साल के मेंस में आ सकता है new education policy. How do we apply sociological perspective to the Hathras case, which seems to be very personal trouble, which seems very individualistic case? Okay, a Dalit woman being raped by some upper caste man. It may seem very individual. How do we apply sociological narrative or explanation to such instances which seem to be very personal trouble? Okay, now the thing is, before going on to discuss your paper one, the test one, I would like to talk more about sociological imagination itself. Okay, why? Why? Because I believe that sociological imagination, if you have the true knowledge of sociological imagination, which is not just a simple word like imagining something sociologically, no, it is not like that. If you have the true understanding of sociological imagination, which is a very specific concept given by C. Wright Mills, then I believe you can look around you and all the issues that you may read in the newspaper through sociological perspective. Now, what that imagination is all about is something that I'm going to focus on in the lecture itself, in this lecture. And then once I'm done with this, then we'll go on to discuss some of the questions which I feel student could not address properly. Okay, so let us first start off with sociological imagination. Now, sociological imagination is a very specific concept, as I told you. It is as specific as the concept of anomie by Durkheim. It is as specific as concept of alienation by Karl Marx. Okay, it is as specific as the concept of disenchantment by Max Weber. So that way, it is a very specific concept given by Charles Wright Mills, who you often call as C.W. Mills, the same person who has also talked about concepts like power elite and white collar alienation. These are some of the two most important concepts given by C. Wright Mills. Now, the question is, what is sociological imagination? Let us first start with the definition itself, and then we can go on to talk about sociological imagination is a very simple in a very simple manner. Okay, so let me first try to define this concept given by C. Wright Mills, because see, this is the first thing that university all over the world and the departments of sociology all over the world start their lecture off with. This is the first thing that every university professor would start their lecture off with. And not just, it is not just limited to the discourse of universities, it is equally applicable to the UPSC syllabus. And more so when UPSC has asked the same question just 2 years back. In 2018 means sociological imagination's definition was given in the question, and people were asked to write what do they understand by it. Okay, now let us start with the definition itself, and then we can understand what exactly do I mean by it. See, sociological imagination is nothing but a heuristic device which enables us which enables us to understand the personal troubles personal troubles as public issues. Personal troubles as public issues. Okay, now the question is, what do we mean by personal troubles and what do we mean by public issue? Let me give you one example and then I can go on to talk about it. You must have seen some of your friends who are very fat. Okay. आप लोगों ने कभी मजाक भी उड़ाया होगा अपने दोस्तों का जो बड़े मोटे हैं, ठीक है? हम बोलते हैं मोटा है मोटा है मोटा है, खाता रहता है, his habit is not right, his sleep cycle is not good enough, okay, or his diet consumption, his diet pattern is not good enough, okay, his diet pattern is not healthy enough, okay. So we keep on teasing our friends on these things, okay. We somehow, when we are trying to mock him, okay, when we are trying to make fun of him, we are basically trying to attribute the cause of his obesity to his life cycle, to his life cycle, to his routine, to his diet pattern, to his lifestyle. And that way, we are trying to look at the public issue, that is obesity, as a social issue, to the individual. We are trying to limit the larger public issue, that is obesity, to that individual itself. But C. Wright Mills wants us to look at other way around. In the sense, he would want us to not reduce the social issue to the individual, but to look for the social causes or social dimensions to something which perceives or which seems to you very personal trouble. Okay, so this is one thing that C. Wright Mills want us to focus on. Okay, I hope you got it. Now, the fact is, an individual who looks at anything in an individualistic manner, which means, by which I mean someone who is driven by common sense notion, he would definitely give a very naturalistic explanation to someone's obesity, and he would say that it is only because of his lifestyle, or it is only because of his sleep cycle, whatever it is only because of him that he is fat, right? But if you try to look at the same issue through sociological imagination, you will come up with some different reality. What is that reality? See, all over the world, you will see that there are many countries which have imposed tax on fat food. Okay, like for example, Denmark, Norway. There are many other countries like US, UK. These are some of those countries which have imposed a tax on food. The fact is, why someone becomes fatty or obese? Only because the fat food is available at very cheap price. It is easily accessible, and not just accessible, you will get the fat food in no time. Like for example, you would go to McDonald's and ask for a burger or a pizza from a Domino's pizza. You know that it won't take them more than 10 or 15 minutes to serve you the same thing. Okay, so obviously, in this modern society where everything is going on so fast, you would also want to have fast food. Okay, because you want to save your time, right? Now the thing is, in the name of saving your time or in the name of cheap food, what you are actually getting is nothing but a food which is very unhealthy. Okay, which is very unhealthy. Now the fact is, in those countries, the countries which have imposed a tax on fat, what is actually happening? The people are automatically buying fresh vegetables, because the fat food there is very costly. So obviously it is actually influencing, it is actually nudging. See, the government all over the world is actually nudging the people by imposing tax on the fat food, so that people automatically start purchasing something which is considered healthy or organic. But here in India, someone who consumes organic food seems to be very classy. Okay, sometimes we start feeling as if he's very, he's from a well-read family, well-educated family, wealthy family. That is why he could afford organic food or healthy food every day. Okay, but the larger issue is that somehow the state and the private corporation, somehow the state is not imposing that much tax on these fast food chains, and so is the reason why people are getting habituated. People are getting habituated in consuming these things, which they find very easily accessible. Very easily accessible in the sense, you can simply order these things from Swiggy, Zomato, all those things, and these are readily available at very cheap price. So Somehow you will see the larger public issue is that somehow there is a nexus between state and private corporates, which is actually making you obese. It is not your individual food habit which is making you obese. It is larger public issue. Somehow the state and the corporates, somehow there is a kind of nexus which is not letting you change your food behavior. Okay, so this is a sociological imagination. This is one evidence of sociological imagination. Now, C. Wright Mills argue that cutting across all these scholars, like for example Max Weber, Emile Durkheim, and Karl Marx, and Talcott Parsons, in fact, okay, all these scholars uh, did have one thing common across them, and that was sociological imagination itself, and that is why he wrote this book. Now the question is, how did Marx, Durkheim, Weber look at a personal trouble, and how did they start talking about the larger public issues which is responsible for the seemingly personal trouble? So this is something that I'm going to talk about now. Like for example, like for example let me talk about Durkheim's suicide. When Durkheim talks about suicide, he developed a sociological theory of suicide, which means Durkheim clearly argued that suicide is not a psychological fact. For that matter, why an individual committed suicide may be an inquiry of sociology, should a psychology, and should be conducted by a psychologist. But why suicide rate varies from one social group to another social group cannot be the inquiry of psychology, rather it should be the subject matter of sociology. And he believed that what seems to be personal trouble, okay, suicide, okay, is actually the consequence of larger social structure, and it is actually a public issue because suicide rate is constant. Suicide rate, like for example, 2 years back WHO came up with this report that suicide rate all over the world is constant. Globally, every year this many million of people are committing suicide. Like for example, I think there are 8 million or 10 million, something like this. Okay, I have forgotten the figure, but globally every year this much of people are committing suicide. The Hindu came up with this report that every day 30 people, 30 students, in fact, to be very precise, it said that 28 students commit suicide every day in India. That means suicide rate is constant. Now the Durkheim, the cause, the actually the main factor behind Durkheim study was the reason as to why suicide rate is constant and why suicide rate varies from one social group to another social group. See, overall at the national level, suicide rate is constant. Okay, this is one thing that Durkheim wanted to study. Second thing, why suicide rate varies from one group to another group, like religious group, Protestant to Catholic. See, among the Protestants it is high, among the Catholics it is low. Why so? Okay. Among the married it is low, among the unmarried it is very high. Why so? So now basically what seems to be a personal trouble, that is suicide, actually he tried to trace the larger cause behind it, and he found it to be the changes in the forces of integration and regulation. Okay, so somehow he had this sociological imagination, and he believed that whenever economy goes through the periods of boom and bust, suicide rate is going to go increased. It is definitely going to increase. Okay, this was his law, this was his theory, this was his observation, and through this he is see since he believed that social fact should not be reduced to the level of individuals, rather, social fact should be explained through another social fact. In the sense, suicide rate is a social fact, it is constant. Since it is constant, it can be measured. And the reason behind it is also a social fact, which is the changes in the force of integration and regulation. And why the force of integration and regulation change? It changes with the groups. Like for example, among the Protestant, the integration would be very low. Okay, among the Catholics, the integration is very high. So obviously the collective consciousness, the degree of collective consciousness is also varying from one social group to another social group, and it has the impact on the force of integration and regulation, and this ultimately has the impact on the people who are committing suicide. This was his theory. Now therefore, Therefore, I tell my student not to apply the theory of suicide, Durkheim's theory of suicide, on Sushant Singh Rajput. भाई उससे पहले कितने न जाने कितने लोगों ने सुसाइड किया था. ओके, हर रोज लोग सुसाइड करते हैं, लेकिन nobody would ever want to apply the theory of Durkheim's theory of suicide on anybody else. But one day, suddenly, when Sushant Singh Rajput committed suicide, next day the students of sociology started applying Durkheim's theory of suicide on Sushant Singh Rajput, as if Sushant Singh Rajput was very close to Durkheim, or he was his brother-in-law. Okay, no. See, you cannot talk about the suicide of Sushant Singh Rajput sociologically. You can definitely talk about farmer suicide, or you can also talk about suicide among the media personalities. But you cannot talk about Sushant Singh Rajput's suicide. The personal trouble is not, the study of personal trouble is not sociology, it is the domain of psychology. Rather, the study of sociology, or the subject matter of sociology, is the larger public issues. Okay, why people committing suicide? Okay, why suicide rate varies from one group to another group? Okay, why people committing suicide, individual committing suicide, is the subject matter of psychology. Okay, now, so Durkheim, through his theory of suicide, tried to show that individual committing suicide, ये पंखा है, ये रस्सी है. Okay, individual committing suicide is not the inquiry of sociology, it is the inquiry of psychology. But why suicide rate varies from one social group to another social group, or why suicide rate is constant? This should be the subject matter of sociology. This should be the inquiry of sociology. And in both the things, in both the question, the one thing that is common is suicide rate. I'm talking about suicide rate. I'm not talking about suicide. Please remember this. Suicide is not the inquiry of sociology. Suicide rate is definitely. Okay. Now, coming to the next question. How do we analyze some other seemingly personal trouble through larger social structures? Okay, like for example, let me come to Karl Marx. So Marx has talked about a concept which is equally dealt by the psychologist as well, and that concept is that of alienation. Okay, alienation. Now see, alienation is actually felt by the individuals as well, and whenever they are in the state of anxiety, they are in state of depression, they are in state of disillusionment, every individual goes through the period that a psychologist would call as alienation. He is somehow feeling alienated from his family members. He is somehow feeling alienated, in the sense he is feeling excluded. Okay, and somehow he has developed that anxiety, depression, frustration. Okay, but Marx would call alienation a very class specific phenomenon, and somehow he believes that the people who were the creative being, the people who were the laboring being, the productive being, somehow that class, the working class, is now feeling alienated from the very creation that was created by this class itself, and that was market. The working class is now feeling alienated from the market, from the production process, from the product, and from the people who were involved in the production process. Now, a god, the god in fact, for example, Feuerbach argues, Ludwig Feuerbach, whose student was Sigmund Freud. Okay, Ludwig Feuerbach argues that somehow the religion is actually the making of man. He has given anthropological theory of religion. He says that that God or religion is the making of man. But we have elevated God to such an extent that we, the creator of this so-called creation that is God, have now become alienated from our very own creation that is God. We think of God as powerful, almighty, the most moral person in this world, in this universe. Okay, someone who is over and above the dukha, the pleasure, the leisure, everything. And by elevating God to such an extent, somehow we set for ourselves an individual who we can aspire to become like. So something of this sort is actually happening at the level of commodities. Everybody look at commodity in such a manner, although it is our own creation. Like for example, in Delhi, you would you can easily look at BMW roaming around here and there. Okay, Lamborghini F1, and you may even think of iPhone 12, which is yet to come, in PlayStation 5, which is going to come next month. No, okay. So, but now our desire to have those commodities is very much equivalent to the desire to become someone like Almighty. Okay. Now, Marx would say these are our own creation, but somehow we have developed fetish towards these commodities. And by attributing the value that we have attributed to these commodities, by elevating those commodities to such an extent, we, the creators of these commodities, have somehow become alienated from our own creation, that is commodities. And for that matter, market is basically nothing but the fetish of commodity being concentrated at the macro level. It is nothing. Market somehow has actually come into existence only because of the labor. So labor, he believed, that is variable capital, is actually the true source of value. It is the true bearer of value. And somehow this market, because of its so-called laws, okay, somehow Adam Smith believed that market should be looked at as an independent institution. Somehow because of the laws like law of supply and law of demand, which is operating in this so-called market, have now disabled or have now excluded the worker from this marketplace itself. And that is why, in the name of laws, somehow the kind of wage that laborer is getting is being justified. Okay, so at the end of the day, capitalists are actually appropriating their surplus value, the surplus value of the laborers. Okay, and everything is being done in the name of religion. Everything is done in the name of market forces. Okay, and that is how the inequality is justified. Now the thing is, Marx would say that alienation is a larger phenomenon, unlike a psychologist who is dealing with an individual's alienation. So for that matter, alienation can be looked at through both psychological level, and if we limit our discussion on alienation to a psychological level, we would consider it as a personal trouble. But if we talk about sociological angle, we would understand that it is actually the public issue. It is actually the public issue. History of all society hitherto has been history of class struggle, in the sense that historically one historical class, the have-not class, the laboring class, in the name of serfdom, in the name of slavery, in the name of capitalism, has somehow become alienated, not just from the very production process, but also from the product itself, and more so from the people who were involved in the production process, that is communal relations. At one point of time, all of us were together involved in the in the production process. But today somehow the whole social interconnectedness, the natural interconnectedness, has somehow been broken down by the social force of market. Okay, so that's how Marx would talk about alienation. Okay, and it clearly shows the sociological imagination, according to Cigarette Mills, that Karl Marx had. Now let me come to another scholar, that is Max Weber. Did he also have sociological imagination? Let us try to see. Max Weber talks about modernity in terms of the change in the way of thinking. It is the change in the way of thinking. Like, for example, he would not talk about change in the way of thinking of an individual. He is actually talking about change in the way of thinking of the society which is getting rationalized. The bureaucratization of society, the rationalization of society, the advent of formal rationality. So he is talking about how there is a change in the way of thinking. At one point of time, we used to perform traditional social action, but with the gradual rationalization of society, we would now be performing goal rational social action, that is Zweig rational social action. At one point of time, we used to think in terms of practical rationality, but with the gradual rationalization of society, we would rather now be thinking in terms of formal rationality. Now, what do these words mean? Let me simplify. See, an individual who is getting married to someone, or suppose an individual is getting married to a lower caste. Okay, an upper caste man getting married to a lower caste. Now this may look intercaste marriage to you, right? It may also look like his personal choice, but somehow his personal choice has been designed by the state apparatus, because, like, for example, yesterday only Odisha government came up with this Sumangal portal scheme. Sumangal portal is nothing but an apparatus which has been developed by the state to facilitate intercaste marriage among the people. It is like a nudge theory. So basically, you will see that people are now getting married not because of the traditional, not in the name of traditional norms or caste. They are not getting married to the partner from the same caste. Rather, they are getting married to someone just because they know that if they get married to this person, they, for the next 3 years, they are going to get this much of money, that is 2.5 lakh or something like this. Okay, so it is actually the money which has actually driven both partners, one from upper caste and lower caste, to get married to each other. So it is actually formal rationality at play. Formal rationality is all about uh, you know thinking in terms of calculability, efficiency to perform or to achieve the given task, and that the task is to get married. So you are no longer concerned about caste, religion, etc. You are rather getting married to someone because you know that if you get married to this person from the lower caste, you would get money. So that way, marriage today is not sacralizing love between people, it is rather sacralizing the love for the money between the two people. Okay, okay. Now, so is the case with Disenchantment, Iron Cage of Rationality. He is largely talking about the macro picture which is emerging from the whole process of rationalization, and that is why he is not so much interested into personal troubles. Rather, Rather, he is talking about the larger picture, that is public issue, and that public issue is the increasing force of rationalization. Now, why in India? Why in India any Indian would not be as efficient as the European would be, according to Max Weber? Okay, so this may seem to you a question which demands you to look into that individual, why he is not as efficient as the individual from America or Europe. But to Max Weber, this is a larger question. It is the question about comparison between religions. It is actually a question about the elective affinity between religion and economy. Somehow Max Weber believed that Hinduism as a religion, as a religious discourse, does not have those ethics which are required to initiate or to ignite the spirit of capitalism. And that is why he equated Hinduism with Indian. He called Hinduism as the Indian version of Catholicism. Okay, and he believed that Indians are somehow more concerned about the other world, the outer world. That is why in the Hindu philosophy also you would often come across terms like Atman, Paramatma, Dharma, Karma, and all those stages of life, ashrams, okay, moksha, all these things are there. Somehow these things do not infuse amongst us the efficiency, the worth of money, the value that one should give to money, or the value that one should give to time, the value that one should give to work. These things are somehow absent in the Hindu philosophy, unlike Protestant ethics, which centers around and in which somehow the values like time is money. Remember, this is what Benjamin Franklin also said: time is money, credit is money, money begets money, work is worship, be industrious, be frugal. These things are very much absent in the Hindu philosophy. Okay, so what looks to you a personal trouble has actually largely uh, social reasons behind it. Okay, so now, after having gone through these writers, C. Wright Mills argued that you can look around everything. You can look everything around you in sociology through sociological imagination. Like, for example, let me talk about Hathras case, which happened just few days back. Now, Hathras case simply to a common sense person may look very individualistic or personal trouble. It may appear to a common sense man that it is simply a rape of a woman by a man, just like a rape has been happening in the society all over the world. This is just another case, okay, to the already existing cases in the world. But that rape clearly reflects the larger structural issue. It somehow portrays to us that the upper caste people, the dominant caste, the Thakurs, still believe that they have full claim over the body of lower caste women. It is actually the struggle of caste, it is actually the caste struggle which is at play here. Somehow, it is the Brahminical patriarchy which is at play here. It is somehow the control over sexuality of women which is considered not just as privilege but also as a right of the upper caste men which is at play here. So it is also one more thing is at play here, that this rape, okay, unlike the Nirbhaya case, has ignited one another aspect, that is the caste loyalties, the caste solidarities. The women in that village have full loyalty to their caste. They do not have any loyalty to the women issues, and that is why women did not come out in the open against those people who were involved in the rape. Rather those women somehow subscribed to the caste loyalty, to the upper caste loyalty. See, she also believed, okay, women also believed that these are lower caste people, okay, these are not worth it, etc. Although somehow they are the mouthpiece of the caste structure. So it may look like to an individual that it is actually the woman speaking, but no, it is actually the values of the upper caste which is speaking through her mouth. So she has become the mouthpiece of caste structure that way. Okay, so so instead of women movement, rather what we are witnessing today is Akhil Bharatiya Kshatriya Sangathan that is emerging out of that picture. So it has actually become the caste conflict. This issue has actually become conflict between caste, upper caste loyalty, and the people who think beyond caste, who think about gender equality, who think about safe and secure condition for women. So this picture has actually reflected or manifested the conflict between modernity and tradition. It is something more than that. Brahminical patriarchy is a concept given by Uma Chakravarti. So you need to think in those lines. This is what I wanted to focus on. This is what I wanted to emphasize on through this discussion on sociological imagination. Okay, now let us start off with our discussion. See, the first question, if I look into the first question, I'll start off with the last question itself, okay, because this is one of the question which student did not attempt. Okay, let me start off with question number 8, part C. Sociology is limited in its scope. Elaborate. Here, what do you have to talk about? Since it is limited in its scope, okay, so you need to talk about that school which talks about limitations to the scope of sociology, and that school is formalist. Okay, so here you have to talk about formalist school. Now, it is not enough to simply say formalist or simply talk about formalist. You also need to write certain important scholars and their contribution to substantiate your argument that formalist school actually deal with the micro sociology. Okay, like for example, under formalist school you may even talk about Max Weber, social action theory. You can talk about George Simmel, who talks about forms of relationship that sociology should be concerned with. Forms of relationship. What are the forms of relationship? There are three things, three forms that he talk about. One is centralization, decentralization. Second is cooperation, conflict. Third is superordination and subordination. Third scholar that you may introduce here would be Ferdinand Tönnies. And you may talk about the change in the degree of intimacy that he believed should be the subject matter of sociology. So, change in the degree of intimacy. Change in the degree of intimacy, somehow he believed with the gradual advent of modernization, with the gradual advent of industrialization, somehow people have developed individualism amongst them. Somehow the traditional ties of family, kinship, religion are no longer there. Okay, those traditional institutions no longer have that much control over the individual. Okay, this is what Durkheim was equally concerned about, and that's why he talked about anomie. That in the sense that those traditional institutions have no longer that much control or regulation over the individuals. Now people are no longer religious, or they are not much concerned about religion, rather they are becoming individualist. Although Durkheim clearly said this individualism is not egoistic in nature, it is somehow still very much moralistic, and from there on he goes on to discuss division of labor, which can do the same function which at one point of time these institutions were doing, that is to create solidarity. Okay, anyway, so the change in the degree of intimacy, that is Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. Community to association. This involves change in the degree of intimacy. This is something that sociology should study. George Simmel said this is something that sociology should study. Max Weber said this is something that sociology should study. But all of them are German. All the three scholars were German. So basically, formalist school was not, formalist and synthetic is not just the debate on the scope of sociology. It is equally very much about the debate between French sociology and German sociology. Now, none of them are talking about laws of society. Somehow French scholars were discussing laws of society. Somehow they believed that social world could be studied in as scientific manner as is being done in the natural sciences. So that way the apparatus of natural sciences could be employed here in the social world, and we could also develop the same kind of generalizations or laws which are being developed in the natural sciences or natural world. Okay, so German, on the other hand, German sociologists did not have such concern. Okay, they rather wanted to investigate the meanings and motives, or they rather wanted to study the micro aspect of society, that is the forms of relationship, change in the degree of intimacy among the individuals, and the social action, that is the study of meanings and motives. Okay, so this is how you can prove that sociology was limited in its scope. But this debate actually took place only because of the synthetic school. The synthetic school was actually one of the schools that was developed by Auguste Comte and the French scholars. Okay, like Saint-Simon. Now these people believe that just like natural world is governed by laws like law of gravity, so does society. Society also operates through certain laws. Okay, And Auguste Comte believed that we can, through sociology, uncover those laws which are the underlying structures, the underlying laws operating the society. Okay, this was he believed that this should be the task of sociology. Okay, so you will say that formalist school came in response to synthetic school, which actually believed that the scope of sociology is very wide. According to synthetic people, scope of sociology was wide, and they believed that we can do macro study, in the sense we can study family, we can study religion, we can study economy, we can study state, we can study nation, we can study whatsoever you can talk about, whatsoever you can think about. We can study everything under the sun, including the sun itself. Okay, so this was the initial debate between synthetic school and the formalist school. So when you talk about formalist school, you also need to mention few names and their contribution. I'm not asking you to explain those contributions. Like for example, here I did not explain anything. I simply wrote forms of relationship, and simply I drew this diagram and showed the so-called arrows. Okay. Now let us come to the next question. Okay, but yes, how do we end? How do we write the conclusion? Okay, today when you talk about the scope of sociology, you will see that somehow the scope of sociology has become very wide, very, very wide. For example, we may talk about social distancing, just like today all of us are playing this social distance thing. Okay, we have to maintain certain distance from one another, right? Now, it may look the study of micro, but somehow the social distance is at play not just at the interpersonal level, it is also at play at the international level. The world is getting deglobalized. Gone are the days of globalization. People, the nation states have actually started looking inward. And this is how you can explain the Atmanirbhar concept, the Atmanirbharta, the autonomous, the self dependency. Okay, the import substituents. All those things can be explained through the social distance thing. Okay. Now, again, something which I did, instead of looking at social distance as personal trouble, I am actually trying to look at as public issue. Okay, the larger picture attached to it need to be seen. Okay. Now, today, if you talk about the scope of sociology, you will see there is a genre in sociology which has developed, that is digital sociology. In digital sociology, we talk about cyberspace, and we conduct virtual ethnography, we conduct digital ethnography, we conduct, for that matter, we do not visit tribal people anymore, rather we look into the Facebook community, we look into the PUBG community, we look into the communities, the digital communities. Okay. Also, we look into the changing labor relations with the change in economy. Like for example, today we talk about platform economy. We do not just talk about industrial economy. We rather talk about platform economy and the emerging class relations. Today, therefore, we do not talk about proletariats. Today, we talk about cybertariats. Okay, another class which has emerged. If you have seen my last class, you will understand what exactly I'm talking about here. So, digital sociology, post-colonial studies, the studies of globalization, study of dependency theory, all these are few things which have widened the scope of sociology, something which was not there initially. It was all European sociology. Somehow the study of Oriental society has also become part of sociology. But at one point of time, those studies were being conducted by Western people. Today, the same Orientalist in the eyes of Occidental, okay, as what Edward Said says, the same Orientals are now being studied by Oriental themselves. And that is why we have Indology today. Okay, the study of Indian society by the Indians themselves, one of them being G.S. Ghurye. Okay, Govind Sadashiv Ghurye. So this is how you could conclude your answer. Okay. Now, next, how is sociological approach to human actions different from that of psychological approach? Very easy question. So, the next question is, how is sociological approach to human actions different from that of psychological approach? Now, what do we have to write in here? See, you can explain some of the concepts which are generally taken up by psychologists, and then you can explain how sociologists would look at the same phenomena differently. Like for example, we can talk about anomie, we can talk about alienation, we can talk about suicide, we can talk about crime. See, a criminal can be explained by psychologist why he became criminal, but why a group is manifesting crime can only be explained by sociologist. For that matter, why an individual is suffering alienation may be explained by psychologists, but for that matter, why a class suffers from alienation historically can only be explained by a sociologist. Why someone commits suicide may be explained through by a psychologist, but why a social group and the rate of suicide varies from one social group from another social group can only be explained by a sociologist. Okay, so these are few things that can be explained through both sociology and psychology, but in a very different manner. So for that matter, sociology is not doing any different thing. It is only doing the same thing, but differently. Okay, it is looking at the social phenomena through different perspectives. Okay, so like for example, let me take up deviance or crime. Okay. Okay, let us start with deviance. Deviance is one topic which is explained or taken up by Durkheim, which is also explained by Howard Becker through his labeling theory, also taken up by Robert King Morton, who's there in your syllabus, but it is equally explained by psychologists. See, a psychologist, a psychological theory of deviance would be something like this. They would say a person becomes criminal only because of certain kind of mental disorder or some kind of personality traits. Some there may be alter ego to that person, okay, which is not very much visible to everyone. It is latent, hidden alter ego, okay. Or he may also say that it is only because of the learned pattern of aggression that he might have seen amongst his peer group when he was in school days. So that comes under the part of social psychology because it is largely talking about groups. But if you try to look into deviance through sociological perspective, you would understand that deviance is not a personal trouble, rather it is a larger public issue. Why? Because it is only because of the anomie which is rooted in social structure. Merton clearly says that anomie is rooted in social structure. What does he mean? That only because of these culturally defined goals, that we have to become IS, that we have to become wealthy, that we have to become millionaire, that we have to own our own house, that we have to have our own car, that we have to have our own bungalow. All these things are actually, these are culturally defined goals, the so-called great American dream in the American society, and so is the case with the Indian society, where the dream of people is to become an IITN or an IAS officer. It is only because of these dreams that people here in Indian society, or for that matter in American society, are actually deviant. So that way, it is only because of the culturally defined goals of society that society is producing criminals. Now, since not everyone has equal opportunity, and since not everyone has that class privilege, or since not everyone is man, who is considered as the most dominant section, not everyone is upper caste, not everyone is heterosexual, not everyone is Hindu. So since not everyone is a Hindu upper caste man or a heterosexual man, since there are different kind of social locations, because of which they may not be able to get good opportunities. Like for example, if you are a woman, only because of your social location that you are a woman, you may not be able to get the privilege to study at the coaching institutions here in Vajiram, here at Vajiram, or at Level Up, or at Shriram, etc. Because somehow the parents may start treating you as inferior in comparison to a man. Why would they want to invest on girls education? That this is the mentality of patriarchy. So since not everyone belong to that place, since everyone do not have that proper social location, not everyone could have socially legitimate means to achieve this culturally defined goal of becoming IAS officer, etc. All those things. Okay, so that way it is only because of this culturally defined goal which creates strain among the individuals that we have to become IAS officers, that we have to become wealthy, we have to have our own car. It is only because of these culturally defined goals that individuals are subjected to strain. How different groups cope up with this strain is the theory that is being discussed by Robert King Merton in his theory of anomie, in his strain theory, in his theory of deviance. Okay, and this is why he talks about, and this is why he is given this theory, so-called subcultural theory of deviance. Subcultural. Okay, conformists are the people who belong to the mainstream culture, who easily cope up with the strain. They conform to the culturally defined goals, and they go to achieve these goals only through socially legitimate means, plus plus in both. But the other people are subcultures. They either may not subscribe to the culturally defined goal, or they may not either have the socially legitimate means only because of the social location. Like, for example, how else would you explain the the homosexual people, or the sex workers, or the people who are in the begging, who are doing begging in order to sustain their livelihood? How else would you explain them not being able to study at universities? Only because you think they do not have that intellect? No, they have entered into prostitution, they have entered into slavery, they have entered into begging only because they do not have appropriate social location. And since they are looked down at by the dominant section of society, they could not get enough opportunities in the society, and that is why they could not subscribe to the culturally defined goals. Okay, so that is why Merton says that anomie is rooted in the social structure. Okay, it cannot be explained, it should not be reduced to the level of individual. Okay, it is rooted in the social structure. This is the theory of deviance given by Merton. Now, another theory of alienation, this is something that I've already explained. You can talk about Marx. Then another theory you may also talk about here, suicide. Now, all these are actually, to a psychologist, personal troubles. But these people, Merton, Marx and Durkheim, they are looking at these issues as public issues. Okay, so this is how you can differentiate human action in psychology from sociology. So conventionally, you should start off with what psychology theoretically is the study of, and what sociology theoretically is the study of. Once you are done with those 2-3 points, you may go on to explain the differences through such explanations. And when you are giving one example, try to look at the same example through both sociological angle and psychological angle. Do not introduce another example to explain sociological angle. Like, for example, you have explained psychological theory of suicide, but if you're not writing sociological theory of suicide, that means you have not shown comparison. Okay, comparison is the essence here in the answers. Okay, that should be there. The next question is question number 8, part A. I hope I'm not going very fast. In case I'm going very fast, you can easily let me know. Since I believe that most of you have already studied sociology, that is why I'm not explaining. Okay, I'm simply telling you that these should be there in your answers. Okay, in order to fetch more marks. Now the next is question number 8A. Pseudoscience confirms, science disconfirms. Examine the sociological merit of the statement. Discuss whether Marxism is a science or a pseudoscience. Now here, what do you have to do? Here, the first thing should be done is to define science. Then we can talk about pseudoscience. Okay, so let us first try to define science. See, I have asked this question multiple times. Is sociology a science? In what way sociology is scientific, if it is a science? Okay. So, in such questions, people have not really defined certain features of science. See, whenever you are trying to prove whether sociology is science or not, you cannot simply start talking about positivism. You have to define if not define, at least you should provide a working definition of the science, which Max Weber would call as an ideal type of science. Okay, now science can be of different kinds. Okay, but which science are you talking about? For that you need to have an ideal type of science. Like for example, if I were to draw an ideal type of science, I would say that science is empirical. It is concerned with observation. It is concerned with testing. It is theoretical. It is cumulative. The body of knowledge is cumulative. Okay, these are some of the features of science according to me. This is my ideal type. Okay, now let us try to see whether Marxism is a science or not. Okay, like for example, let me read this question once again. Pseudoscience confirms and science disconfirms. Examine the sociological merit of the statement. Discuss whether Marxism is a science or a pseudoscience. See, initially, the founders of sociology like Auguste Comte, Saint-Simon, and Durkheim, these people believed that somehow the same laws or theories can be uncovered and can be explored to explain the social world as well. We can also predict in the social world, just like we predict in, just like the natural scientists make predictions in the natural world. So can we. We can also predict whether when will war happen. We can also predict when will conflict happen between classes. When we can predict when will revolution take place. We can predict when will suicide rate increase or decrease. So these are some of the prediction based theories developed in sociology by the positivist school of philosophy. Okay, so but the fact is, although these theories were developed by the grand theorists like Durkheim, Marx, and Auguste Comte. They talked about laws. Somehow these theories are not testable. You cannot test whether revolution will take place or not. You cannot refute these theories. These theories are not subjected to a test which Karl Popper calls as falsifiability. You cannot falsify these theories. You cannot falsify whether a group has lower rate of suicide only because it is having high force of integration. See, the force of integration or regulation for that matter is not observable. But Durkheim asked us to treat social fact as things, as if they are observable. But can you then test them? Can you test whether it is actually because of the low integration that they are committing suicide? You cannot test these things. Somehow you can see these things, although these are not observable or empirical. See, for that matter, even electromagnetic field is not observable, but you can observe the same through an apparatus. But here in the social sciences, you cannot observe this force of integration or regulation through any kind of apparatus. How would you falsify these theories? If these theories cannot be tested, if these theories cannot be falsified, how can you call positivist approach as scientific? Okay, and this is why Karl Popper called Marxist approach as pseudoscience, since it cannot be falsified. सी, अगर आपका दोस्त क्या है, वो बड़ा खुश है, ठीक है, आप क्या बोलोगे मार्क्सिस्ट अप्रोच से? फॉल्स कॉन्शियसनेस. अगर वो आपका दोस्त बड़ा दुखी है तो आप क्या बोलोगे? एलियनेशन हो गया. अब तो बेसिकली आप दोनों केस में उसको आप सही करवा रहे हो, दोनों केस में आप सही करवा रहे हो उसको, ठीक है, मार्क्सिज्म को. तो फिर वो गलत कहां से है? इन द सेंस कि उसका टेस्ट क्या है? Revolution कब आएगा? Marx said that revolution is inevitable, but Karl Popper would say, how can you say that? What is the proof? Can we test this thing that it is inevitable? No, there is no such test available, and that is why it is pseudoscience. Okay. So these are some of the features which you can write under pseudoscience, and you can then talk about positivism. And positivism is nothing but a belief. Positivism is a belief that true source of knowledge, or true knowledge for that matter, true knowledge about society is scientific knowledge. And in order to understand, in order to have the scientific knowledge of society, we need to apply the methods employed in the natural sciences by the natural scientists. And that is scientific method. And scientific method, for that matter, lives up to these features. It is nothing but a systemized steps. It is having systemized steps. Those steps are there in order to have full understanding and empirical observation and theoretical knowledge of the things that you are going to study. So basically, scientific method is nothing, a method having systematized steps which are put in place in order to have a full-fledged, objective, empirical, testable inquiry of the social world. Okay, and positivist, one of them being Durkheim, actually tried to introduce scientific method to the study of suicide. And he finally developed a law as well, which is the last step of scientific method. And the law was that whenever economy goes through the period of boom or slump, boom or bust, okay, rise or fall, suicide rate is definitely going to increase. This is what his theory was. This is what his prediction was. Okay, but this prediction cannot be tested. There is no test falsifiability. This is what Gibbs, a critique of Durkheim, also argues. Since these forces are not measurable, integration, regulation, or for that matter, suicide rate cannot be. See, you cannot see the force of integration. You cannot see the force of regulation. You cannot directly say that society is healthy or abnormal or diseased. These are value loaded statements. You are not being scientific in your approach. You are completely letting your values out. How can you say that it is a purely objective research? It is not standing the test of objectivity, for that matter. Okay. So Karl Popper here comes in, and Karl Popper argues that positivism follows inductive approach. And verifiability. Positivist theory follows inductive approach and verifiability. What is inductive approach? You look at few people and then you tend to generalize your observation. You collected data from the police station. I'm talking about Durkheim. He collected data from the police station about certain Protestants, about certain Catholics, about certain men, about certain women, about married people, about unmarried people, about married Protestant men, which is a multivariate analysis coming here. Okay, because I'm talking about the whole picture. Now I'm not only looking at a particular social location or social group. I'm talking about intersectional analysis. Okay, so Karl Popper would say that few people were observed and then it was generalized that Protestant have low integration. Okay, this is what Popper would argue. But Popper would say that how can you test whether they actually had low integration? Can you check that force? Can you really put that force to a test? There is no such test available for it. Okay, so that is why. Secondly, he also talks about verifiability in the sense that natural science, in the name of following natural sciences or the discourse of natural sciences, what social scientists does generally is to keep collecting the data until they verify, in order to verify their thesis. Like for example, you said all swans are white, so you would keep looking for white swans in order to prove your thesis right. But if you are not looking for a black swan, that means you are being blind to the social world. Somehow you're not ready to accept that your theory can also be falsified. So we should neglect this approach, we should sideline this approach, and we should go in favor of another approach that Karl Popper calls as the approach of deductive reasoning and falsifiability. So, and from here on, post-positivism came into existence. Okay, so Popper rejected this and he talked about post-positivism, which is largely concerned with deductive reasoning and falsifiability approach. And in inductive reasoning, what happens is you go from specific to general. But in deductive reasoning, you go from general to specific. In the sense, you start off with a hypothesis and you start collecting data in order to negate your hypothesis. You start actually looking for data which can falsify your thesis. That means you are ready to accept. You are ready to accept the criticism. In the sense, you are completely open to the criticism as well. You are equally open to the other dimensions of reality. You are not simply collecting data in order to prove your thesis right, but you are also ready to collect data which can falsify your thesis, and that approach, Karl Popper argued, would be the truly scientific approach. Okay, so you can easily say that Marxism is a pseudoscience according to Karl Popper. Okay, now this question is done, I think. Yes. Now the next question is question number 7. The significance or source of hypothesis in social research. You can easily do this question. I don't think there's any problem in this question. I've already given explanation to you, so you can use the same explanation, and in case you feel any kind of problem, you can let me know. See, the source of hypothesis can be anything. You can see, like for example, there are many scholars who have had hypothesis in their dream experience. Okay, there is one psychologist, Kevin Derber. Kevin Derber says that 40 to 50% of the uh, experiments conducted in sciences were serendipitous, in the sense they were outcome of accidentally done. Okay, like for example, Ramanujan, he actually came up with his theory, many of the theories on mathematics, through some dream. He actually saw some Devi coming into his dream and telling him about those equations, and finally, after years of death of Ramanujan, those theories today stands validated, and a movie was also made on Ramanujan for the same reason. Okay. In fact, the structure of benzene, I don't know how many of you actually remember the structure of benzene, which was something like this. This structure actually came in the dream of that person. Okay, and in the dream he saw some snakes hovering around or revolving around a pyre, sacred pyre. It was fire around which the snakes were revolving. That's how he came up with this structure of benzene. Okay. Anyway, what is so scientific about sociology that makes it a science? Again, same kind of question. How do we approach such questions? Okay. Because sociology, when I say that what makes sociology a science, sociology for that matter is not just limited to positivism or non-positivism. In fact, there is one huge error which is committed by most of the students, which I'll explain to you in a short while. See, what happened is that most of the students that believe that interpretative approach is not scientific. This is what students believe. See, the fact is, Max Weber himself called sociology science. Max Weber said sociology is science insofar it is concerned with the study of social action, its causes, and its consequence. See, the problem is that you tend to confuse interpretative approach with Max Weber only. Interpretative approach is something more than that. It includes Max Weber, but it actually starts off with Max Weber, but then it also includes many other theories for which the writings of Max Weber, according to Alfred Schutz, seem to be indispensable, and one of them being phenomenology. Okay, so Max Weber said that sociology is science insofar it is concerned with study of social action, its causes, and its consequence. Okay, so social action, its causes, and the consequence of that social action. So it is actually the cause and effect that we are looking into through social action. That is why it is scientific. Okay, it may not be science in a way that natural science is, but it is science of its own type. See, whenever you confront such question, first thing that you have to do is to talk about an ideal type of science. And if there is a variation in your ideal type and the kind of science that you are talking about in divergences to the ideal type that you have formed, it does not mean that those things which are diverging from your ideal type are not sciences. Rather, it is letting you explore the different variants of sciences. Like for example, there is one scholar, Bourdieu. Bourdieu says sociology is science insofar it helps us in revealing something which is hidden, latent function. The latent function analysis is also considered as scientific. Okay. Science also helps us in exploring something which is hidden and unexplored. And for that matter, sociology also does the same thing. It helps us in enlightening us. It helps us in emancipation. It helps us in exploring the world in a way which we have never ever thought about. So that way sociology is science. Okay. So let me give you a proper structure of this question. What do you have to do here is start with working definition of science. You can talk about features. You can talk about features, and then you can discuss positivism, how those features are very much present in positivism, and how positivism also develop laws. Then you can go on discussing some positive scholars who have developed some laws. Law of three stage. Marx talks about a law of dialectics, which is actually postulated by Hegel and enunciated by Engels, but actually looked into the social world by Karl Marx. Okay, ये क्या हो गया? हो जाता है. Durkheim, again he talks about laws. Okay. But the fact is these laws are not testable, which means one of the feature, testability, is absent. Okay. That does not mean they are not sciences. Somehow but you would talk about how in the analysis of these people, in the whole pursuit of making sociology a science, somehow the individual consciousness was neglected. Somehow individuals were treated at par with the atoms or the objects in the natural world. It was believed that they are simply just like atoms in the natural world are reacting to the external stimuli. So is the case with these individuals or classes or social groups. Okay, they are also responding to certain external stimuli like law of integration regulation, or for that societogenic currents, or for that matter law of dialectics. Okay, it's all those things. Law of three stages, law of succession, law of coexistence, all those things. Okay, but you can then go on discuss about Max Weber, who had a very unique conception of science. In the social world, we can only talk about ideal types. We can only talk about models of reality, because in social world, the reality may be perceived by the people differently. It all depends on your social location. So for that matter, this is one of the reasons why some people who studied Protestant ethics after Max Weber did not look at the Protestant ethics the way Max Weber did. So it all depends on your social location as well. So how can you achieve objectivity in the social world? And so is the case with participant observation or ethnography. Okay. Now, Max Weber talks about the science of social action. Can it be proven right? Again, it cannot be tested. For that matter, Max Weber himself said that I am not being determinist. There are multiple causes. So that way, he is not trying to project the social action, the study of social action, in as grand theoretical fashion or as scientific fashion as is being done by the positivist scholar. For that matter, he actually developed his own ideal type of science. Okay, where the study of social action, the meaning motive is becoming more important, where the notion of value neutrality, the notion of value relevance are more important than objectivity. Okay, so here instead of objectivity, Max Weber would talk about value relevance or value neutrality. And by the way, both of these things are very much different. Value relevance is very much in consonance with the idea given by Emil Goldner, that is of domain assumptions. It is your own social location. Marxists are trying to see the oppression of a class by another class. Feminists trying to see the oppression of women by man. Okay, for that matter, it is your domain assumption. Since you are feminist, since you are Marxist, that is why you're looking at the world like this: oppression of a group by another group. So at the end of the day, it is your theoretical social location. Until you are being reflexive about it, that it was only because of your social location that you have actually studied or looked at the world the way you actually did. Unless you are being reflexive about it and you are letting the reader know that it was your social location which determined your thesis, that may not be scientific unless you let the reader know about it, which is actually called as reflexivity, a notion of its own type in social sciences, which is somehow absent in the natural sciences, because in natural sciences, generally objectivity completely stands for value freedom. Okay, and here in the natural sciences, it is believed that the value of the scientist is not influencing the research. Okay, anyway, so once you discuss Max Weber, then you may go on to discuss phenomenology. And for that matter, ethnomethodology and symbolic interactionism are as much part of phenomenology as much functionalism and Marxism is that of positivism. So you may please stop reading these things differently from one another. Ethnomethodology and symbolic interactionism are actually the product of phenomenology, and structural functionalism and Marxism are actually the product of positivism. Actually, both of them are positivist theory. Similarly, both ethnomethodology, symbolic interactionists are both of them phenomenological theories. Okay, then you may go on to discuss that how these people negated the notion of objectivity altogether. They believe there is no objectivity in the social sciences, in the social world. Okay, some people, all the people, in fact, they believe they impose meaning on the objects. Okay, and those meanings cannot be verified, and those meanings vary from one individual to another individual. Unless those meanings are being shared by the collectivity, there would be no social order. But somehow they believed that largely in most of the cases, the meanings are shared. Meanings are shared. The life world is a stock of knowledge. The stock of knowledge consists of the meanings imposed by the world, by the members of society onto certain objects. Okay, what kind of meanings? Like, for example, let me talk about sedition. Okay, so to speak against the government may be considered as the act of sedition, but Supreme Court would come up with its own interpretation of sedition, and they would say it is not to speak against the government that would amount to be called as sedition. Rather, it is the violent revolution against the state that should be deemed as sedition. So again, the notion of sedition varies from one section to another section, from one individual to another individual. It also varies which political party you belong to. BJP would consider the act to speak against the government as sedition. Congress may not. It all depends on your social location. Okay, unless those meanings are being shared, there would be no social order. There would only be conflict, and this is why there is a conflict. To Ayodhya, your social location may impose some different kind of meaning, and some other social location may impose some different kind of meaning. For Hindus, it may now be sacred. Okay, but to Muslim, the notion of that sacred may actually create conflict between those people. Okay, so there is no objectivity in social world. You cannot establish any objectivity in the social world. How else would you explain Supreme Court delaying the judgment on Ayodhya? Yes, chalo, karo. So this was all about sociology as science, but yes, Other than these traditional scholars, you may also talk about some scholars who have defined science in their own way. Okay, but I am not going to discuss those scholars right now, because anyhow, you have many questions dealing with whether sociology is science or not in the next round as well. Okay, so I may as well talk about Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn says that sociology, unlike the natural sciences, is pre-paradigmatic in the sense that it is young science. Pre-paradigmatic does not mean it is not science at all. Rather, unlike natural sciences, where we have one dominant paradigm like Newtonian physics, which is now being questioned and is now being substituted by Einsteinian physics, that is warping theory of space and time compression, all those things. Now, since Einsteinian physics is considered as the most dominant paradigm and it is equally acceptable amongst everyone, universalist principle of Merton according to the norms of sciences that he talks about, so it is universally acceptable. Okay, so it is not that women scholars are rejecting Einstein. It is not feminist. There is no feminism in Einstein physics. Okay, it is equally irrespective of your nation, religion, ethnicity, caste, kinship, or gender. This Einsteinian physics is valid and acceptable by everyone, and it can be tested as well. It has been tested by the interferometer experiment. But on the other hand, in case if you want to explain something in social sciences, there are multiple incommensurate and mutually conflicting paradigms available. Like, for example, you can explain the same thing through Marxism, you can explain even the same thing through functionalism, you can explain the same thing through feminism, and each time you would come up with some different answers. So how would you say that it is objective? It is consisting of multiple perspectives, and that is why George Ritzer calls sociology as multi-paradigmatic science. In fact, there are many approach to say whether it is science or not. There is one scholar like A.R. Louch who says that any science which actually studies human action scientifically is actually a moral science. So moral science is also a science that way. You cannot simply reject moral science uh, as not being scientific at all. When you are saying that it is not scientific, you have that notion of natural science in your mind. So you have to differentiate these things. Okay, so safely you can conclude that sociology is the most scientific amongst all humanities, and it is the most humanistic amongst all sciences. Okay, instead of throwing names and names, I think you can simply talk about positivism, which had the determination to prove sociology as scientific. Weber, who argued a science of its own kind. Okay, and then you may even talk about the multi-paradigms in sociology, which somehow does not let it become as scientific as natural sciences is. But today, in the postmodern era, there are scholars like Lyotard who have even rejected the notion of science altogether, because they believe that even science has now started talking about something which cannot be tested, or which may not seem objective, like, for example, string theory, quantum physics. So there is no end to it. At the end of the day, what structure you have to follow is start with scholars who start with the definition of science or give some features of science, then talk about school which argues that sociology is science exactly in this manner, then try to show the limitations. Okay, in the limitations I talked about Weber, but Weber never said that sociology is not science. He also said sociology is science, but science of its own type. Okay, he also looks into cause and effect for that matter, but he, unlike natural sciences, is not being determinist. He is saying that there are multiple causes. Multi-causality is an approach that is given by Weber. Fechtian approach, that is of understanding the human action, the meaning and motive, something which is absent in the natural sciences, because they are not interested in looking at the meaning and motive of the atoms. They simply believe that those atoms are actually responding to the external stimuli as it is. Okay, so, and then you may even discuss how today science, the very notion of science, is being rejected in the social sciences. Here you may discuss postmodern scholars and you may end the debate. Or you may even say that there are some other types of sciences, like, for example, moral science by A.R. Louch. Moral science. And he considers sociology as one of them. Okay, so at the end of the day, you have to make a structure. You cannot simply go on to write scholars and scholars and scholars. You have to discuss, you have to have a structure in your answer. Okay. Now, what are the major theoretical strands of research methodology? Again, a very simple question. For as far as the major strands in sociology is concerned, you may even simply draw this diagram. The same diagram which I had drawn in my last video, which is uploaded in the YouTube as well. This is macro sociology, structural approach, and structural approach. And herein follows positivism. Then you can talk about micro sociology. Here you may talk about action approach. Under positivism, you may even talk about Marxism, structural functionalism. Both talk about certain laws and social order, certain patterns in society, institutions governing us, okay, certain laws. On the other hand, micro talks about the understanding of the meanings and motives. Okay, it is non-positivism. Understanding of the meanings and motives, meaning and motive of individuals' action. Individual's action. Okay. And then you may even discuss how the macro and micro are actually finally connected by Anthony Giddens. Anthony Giddens, structuration theory. Structuration theory. Okay. Structuration theory is nothing but it simply says that structure, there is a duality of structure in the sense structure not only constrains the individual, it also enables the individual to modify the structure itself. Like for example, language not simply is constraining me, it is not as if I am following certain rules and I am very much conscious of those rules and somehow it is constraining me to speak exactly without distorting the grammar of that English language. It is not simply constraining me, rather I have certain agency in my hand to modify the English language and to say hi, what's up. So what's up may not be the official or the legit word in the English language or lexicon, but somehow over a period of time it may be included in the lexicon. So that is how you can modify the language, and so is the case with family. Family does not only regulate you, you may even change the structure of family. And from here on we started talking about from joint to nuclear. From nuclear we started talking about single parent family, gay family, lesbian family, or even live-in relationships. So that shows the extent to which agents have certain agency in changing the structures as well. So structure regulates us, but it also enables us to modify the structure as well. Okay. Now, next question is question number 6. I don't think we need to discuss question number 6a. What makes sociologists different from other members of society? I think that's very much clear. You need to simply discuss the sociology versus common sense. But by the end of that answer, you should also explain how sociology today understand the meaning, in the sense when Max Weber talks about the study of social action, basically he's trying to integrate common sense and sociology, because he believes that unless we study the common sense, so-called the meanings and motive, there would be no exercise the sociological inquiry, there would be no meaningful sociological inquiry. How else would you explain Max Weber explaining the rise of capitalism? Only because he could understand what Protestant ethics that we study as actually was nothing but the common sense of the among the Protestants. That's how their life was. Okay, it was common sense for them to work the way they were actually doing, to look at the world around them the way they used to do. Okay. What are variables is something that you can easily do. Basic features of symbolic interactionism, sociology of everyday life. You can easily talk about micro sociology. See, in case you feel any kind of doubt, you can ask me and let me know. Okay. So section B, I don't think we need to discuss any further, because those were the questions that I wanted to have a discussion on, because many of the students did not even attempt those questions. So I feel somehow that you were lacking in those areas, so I tried to address those issues. Okay, so in case if you want me to cover rest of the part from section A, you can please let me know. Otherwise, we can safely proceed with test 2's discussion. So you can easily let me know after having gone through this video. Please let me know if you really need the discussion on section A, or should we simply proceed with a discussion, the full-fledged discussion of the paper 2, that is your discussion on Marx, Weber and Durkheim. Okay, so with this I think I don't think I need to discuss anything else with you. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.
Hit the bell icon to never miss an update from Level Up IAS. Make sure you like, share, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.